To the historical Jewish mind, Jerusalem was the center of the universe. It was a conjunction of the most important things in the world. Which people was the holiest people of all the peoples in the world? It must be the Jewish people. And which group within that people was the holiest group? It was the Levites who ran the service at the temple in Jerusalem. And which clan within that tribe? It was the Kohanim, the priests, and even the high priests, as the holiest person in the universe. What was the holiest language of all the world? It must be the Hebrew that defined Jewish practice. And what was the holiest word in the holiest language? It was the name you're not supposed to say, the name of God. And that was spoken by the high priest at only one time of year. And what would be the holiest time of year? It was Yom Kippur. And then, where did that holiest person say that holiest word at the holiest moment? In the holiest place. Which country is the holiest of all the countries? The land of Israel. Which city is the holiest of all the cities? Jerusalem. And which spot in Jerusalem was the Holy of Holies? It was the Holy of Holies. The Kodesh HaKodashim in the temple, on the Temple Mount, in the heart of Jerusalem. Today you hear of Jerusalem in political rhetoric as the eternal and undivided capital of Israel. And yet, I remember one of my first trips to Israel, I got a tourist map of the streets of Jerusalem, and it had all of the streets named, which is actually a wonderful review of Jewish history. If you could identify every person and place on the street map, you'd know a lot. Except there were maybe a third of the streets that had almost no names on them. Those were on the eastern part of the map. They were what had been East Jerusalem, now the eastern half of the eternal and unified city of Jerusalem, and yet, why were there no street names on them? Because that was Arab East Jerusalem, and why would any tourist go there? They didn't need those names on the map. The reality is that if you enter one side of the old city from West Jerusalem, and then exit the other side of the old city into East Jerusalem, you feel like you're in a different place. The language, the architecture, the complexion of the people, the feel in the air, it's like it's a different city. Because for a long time, it was. This past week, Israel observed Jerusalem Day, which commemorates the date on the Jewish calendar of the Israeli conquest of Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. It took place in our general calendar on 6/7/67. So if you know about the current phenomenon of making fun of any time the numbers 6 and 7 show up next to each other, as if it's some kind of funny, disastrous thing, well, there's an irony there that at least the way Americans do dates, it was 6/7/67. If you're European, it was 7/6/67. Still the same numbers. It was a couple of days into the war that began on June 5th. What's begun over the last couple decades is to use Jerusalem Day not as a day to celebrate the diversity of a unified Jerusalem. It's a day to celebrate the authority of a Jewish-owned Jerusalem. There's a terrible ritual called the Flag March, sometimes called the Flag Dance, where tens of thousands of right-wing nationalists march with flags and whistles and noise with Israeli flags through the Muslim quarter of the old city, Davka, especially that place. And they make their way from the gates through the Muslim quarter to the Western Wall. It's a way of asserting their power. And alongside this comes vandalism, comes racist chants. A classic is death to Arabs over and over again. Or another one, Yehudi Nishama Aravi Benzona, which, pardon the language, means a Jew is a soul, an Arab is a son of a whore. It is disgusting. It's an assertion of sovereignty. This year, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the Minister of Police and from a very right-wing settler party, showed up on the Temple Mount, which is where the Dome of the Rock is, with a large Israeli flag to unfold and display there and take a picture and post it on social media, as if to say, this is mine. It's an expression of dominance and hostility and hatred. And even mainstream Israelis are somewhat repulsed by this offensive march. But there's something about Jerusalem that has all this emotional energy invested in it that makes it something that people want to own, to claim, to desire, to envision in some way. So I want to share with you the text of a psalm in the Hebrew Bible. It's Psalm 137. And the language may be somewhat familiar because it's part of the traditional prayer and blessing over meals that's recited regularly. It's part of other Jewish liturgy as well. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat. We sat and wept as we thought of Zion. Remember, Zion is one of the hills in Jerusalem, so it's a stand-in for the city. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. Perform for us, you minstrels. How can we sing a song of God on alien soil? And here's the key line. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. One of the reasonings given for the breaking of a glass at a wedding is that you remember the destruction of Jerusalem even at your happiest hour. And the psalm concludes, remember, O Eternal One, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on the one who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on the one who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. What do you hear in this psalm? Anger, revenge, some nastiness too. I also hear longing, a sense of exile and homelessness, a desire to return home where I belong, where I was happy, where I was meant to be. A desire to cancel that exile and go back. And go back to an imagined homeland. You know, after years and years away from that place, you're remembering it with the, gold haze of loving memory that may not be as accurate as documentary evidence. So there's a desire to return home, there's an anger at those who might have kept you away, and there's an idealism of what it could be. In medieval Passover Haggadot, which were decorated with beautiful illuminations, they imagined what Jerusalem would be like. Because after all, at the end of the Seder, they would say, L'shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Not next year on the beach, or next year on a cruise. It was next year where I belong, in this place, Jerusalem. So it was part of the idealism, looking back on their past and looking forward to an imagined messianic future. So all of these emotions are tied up in this city, in this place, and get expressed sometimes in one moment, where some are joyful to have a unified Jerusalem. I did see some people marching in a celebration of Jewish and Arab diversity in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, but others are the latter part of this and celebrating the revenge. In the Babylonian Talmud, there's a passage that says all it needs to say about this idea of the chosenness of the people and the place. It says, 10 measures of chokhmah, of wisdom, were given to the world. The land of Israel received 9, while the rest of the world received 1. And 10 measures of beauty were given to the world. Jerusalem received 9, while the rest of the world received 1. I'm curious how many here have actually visited Jerusalem? Well, about a third, maybe a third to a half. Jerusalem today is a beautiful city. When you drive up the mountains from the coastal plain and you see the buildings, you come around these curves, and it really is very striking. The setting sun turns the city a kind of gold, just like that song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, the Golden Jerusalem, written actually before the Six-Day War, but became very popular afterwards. It's also because of the building code requirement that new buildings have to be built with that particular Jerusalem stone style, so that it adds to the effect, but it's also by code. It has a deep and complicated and conflicted history. It's claimed by both Jews and by Palestinians as the capital of the state. Jerusalem on one side, Al-Quds on the other. The modern Hebrew University was founded there in 1918 by Chaim Weizmann, who would become the first president of Israel, and Albert Einstein was there at the founding too. And the Israeli National Art Academy, Bezalel, named after a character in the Hebrew Bible who builds the ark, that was founded in 1906 in Jerusalem. There are world-class museums, and there's a state-of-the-art modern light rail system now that's been put in place. There's about 1 million residents living in about 50 square miles. It includes 350,000 Jews living in the western half of the city, which is almost entirely Jewish. And in East Jerusalem, there's about 400,000 Arabs and another 250,000 Jews living east of what used to be called the Green Line, between the halves of the city. And of the Jewish population of Jerusalem, of that some 600,000, 46% are ultra-Orthodox. So almost half of the Jews there are ultra-Orthodox. Another 25% are religious or very religious, dati they would say in Hebrew. Another 13% are traditional, which means if they want to go to the beach on Saturday, they can do that, but if they go to synagogue, they go to an Orthodox one. And there's about 13% of the Jews in Jerusalem who are secular, including some of my friends who live there. It's also one of the poorest cities in Israel, because 40% of the population lives below the poverty line, both in the Arab community but also in the ultra-Orthodox community. There's a contradiction of Jerusalem. It's visible in any picture you see of the cityscape. It's like that lyric we heard in the song, it's a city with a wall in its heart. That's that western wall. It's called the Kotel in Hebrew, in the old city of Jerusalem. It was the retaining wall closest to the Holy of Holies on the Temple Mount. And the claim was that, according to Jewish tradition, on that Temple Mount, Abraham, the patriarch, was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac when commanded by the Hebrew God. Now, above that wall, you can see, and it's visible in just about every postcard of the city you could buy, that beautiful golden dome. That's the golden dome of the Rock, which, according to Islamic tradition, is the same Temple Mount from which Muhammad left on his midnight journey to the heavens on his horse Al-Buraq, and it's also where Ibrahim almost sacrificed his son Ismail. Same story, different tradition, with different claims to pedigree. And just a few blocks away of this western wall and this Dome of the Rock is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which claims to be the location encompassing the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. You can see there's a basis for conflict right there. It's called the City of David because the claim is, in the Hebrew Bible, that David conquered this city from the Jebusites around the year 1000 BCE, is where it's often dated. It was later conquered and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, leading to that exile where we had the Psalm 137, longing to return. And some Jews did return. Some Jews stayed in Babylon, but some Jews returned and rebuilt Jerusalem around 515 BCE. Another 500 years later, it was destroyed again by the Romans, and it was redestroyed during a revolt when the Romans attempted to build a Roman temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem about 60 years later. The walls that we see today on the outside of the city were built in the Ottoman period to protect the city. But think about the scale of the old city compared to the modern city. The old city is less than half a square mile compared to 50 square miles for the whole city. It's 1% of the modern city area. After 1860, a new city began to be developed. That's why it's called the Old City. It used to be just called the city, because that was it. But now it's the old city compared to the new city built outside the walls that began to develop in the 1860s. It was accelerated by Zionist resettlement there, but also during the British Mandate period, a lot of economic development and a lot of tourism. It became open to the Western world in a way it was harder to get to in the Ottoman period. And so you have the King David Hotel overlooking the old city, developed in this period. You have new neighborhoods and new institutions founded, and new Palestinians who also moved to the area for the economic development. Now, in 1947, when Israel was declared a possible state by the United Nations, they had a plan for Jerusalem. It is classic bureaucratic nonsense. The plan was, let's make Jerusalem an international city. So we don't have to assign it to either the Arab state or the Jewish state. It'll just be an international. Do you know of any international cities in the world that are run by the UN? Would you trust the UN to run an international city? Maybe not. It didn't solve the problem, of course. Even before the state was declared, in May of 1948, there were battles and convoys trying to make their way to supply Jerusalem that were being attacked from villages on the hillsides, which led to the depopulation or expulsion of the people living in those villages as part of the ongoing conflict, and occasionally even a massacre, and most famously in Deir Yassin, a village overlooking the road to Jerusalem. The Israeli War of Independence, by Palestinians called the Nakba, or the disaster, was also reflected in Jerusalem. Some 30,000 Arabs left their homes in West Jerusalem, leaving behind archives and libraries and all kinds of personal resources and effects. And Jordan expelled the 1,500 Jews who had been living in the old city and didn't allow them to return. During that period, from 1948 to 1967, there was no Jewish access to the old city at all. Jews could not go to the Western Wall. Israelis could not go to the famous Mount of Olives cemetery on a hill overlooking the old city. They couldn't go to any of the sites in the West Bank either. And that cemetery in particular is a beautiful location. It's actually one of the best views of the old city you can find. And it has graves dating back 500 years, maybe 100,000 tombs in all in the space. And even here in Chicago, there are little bits of that Mount of Olives around, because when you go to do a cemetery burial, and they give you a little bit of earth from the land of Israel, a little plastic bag it comes in says, from the Mount of Olives. And the idea is you want to be buried with a little bit of the land of Israel connected to you, whether you believe in resurrection or not. It's a sense of connection to your roots. But those are coming from that cemetery in East Jerusalem. That was the historic Jewish cemetery going back 500 years before there was a split between East and West Jerusalem. There was a no man's land behind the King David Hotel that occasionally had potshots at it. The synagogues that had existed in the old city were destroyed, burned down, and even the Western Wall was largely neglected, occasionally had graffiti added to it. Now, by the mid-1960s, Israel had developed West Jerusalem as its own capital. They had declared Jerusalem to be the capital of the country from the beginning, even though it was in a war zone. But in Western Jerusalem, they established a new national center on a mountaintop. It was where they put their parliament, the Knesset, designed to look like the Parthenon. It was where the Supreme Court met. It was where the Israel Museum was founded, and where they created a new kind of a temple. In this case, not a Heichal, a temple of God, it was a Heichal HaSefer, a temple of the book, or a shrine of the book dedicated to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and more importantly, to the concept of Jews using the Hebrew language going back centuries. That's their rootedness. And so they had a military cemetery there too. It was like Arlington National Cemetery and the Supreme Court and Congress. It was all in one place, and it was in West Jerusalem. It was still Jerusalem, it was just West Jerusalem. The world didn't recognize Israel having Jerusalem as its capital, however, and that's why many countries put their embassies in Tel Aviv instead. And to be honest, this goes back to the Roman period. Diplomats would much prefer to be on the coast than to be up in the hills in Jerusalem. Maybe not now with the developed city, but certainly in the ancient world that was the case. So here we are, 1967. The war begins on the 5th of June on the Egyptian front with an air raid that destroys most of the Egyptian Air Force and an invasion of the Sinai. Jordan begins to shell Jerusalem later that day on the 5th, and eventually Israel strikes back and manages to defeat the Jordanian army, not only in East Jerusalem and in the Old City, but also all of the West Bank becomes under Israeli control, all the way to the Jordan River. 2 paratrooper troops are sent in. They conquer the Old City, and there's a famous picture of these young paratroopers standing next to the Western Wall, and the photographer got down low and got a picture of their faces and the wall above them, and they're looking up in wonder. And poets commented that these would be students with us. These 18, 19-year-olds were born when the state was, and here they are liberating this ancient shrine. Well, there were mistakes made even in that early stage. After the Temple Mount was conquered, somebody climbed to the top and put an Israeli flag on the top of the dome. That was taken down very quickly because they realized that was inflammatory, that was dangerous. That could lead to a regional confrontation over who's in charge of the Dome of the Rock. And yet, other things happened very quickly. If you've been to Jerusalem and you've seen the Western Wall, you've seen that big, beautiful plaza that's in front of the wall. That plaza didn't used to be there. If you see pictures of the Western Wall from the 1920s and 30s and even 40s, you'll notice a couple of things. One is there was no men-women divider at the time. You could stand with anybody you wanted to. Now it's gender segregated. But the other thing you'll notice is that there's only maybe 10 feet worth of space in front of the wall, and then there are houses there. But there are no houses there now. Where did they go? Well, what happened was, within 3 days of the end of the war, in came the bulldozers. Now, there was a practical side to the plan. It was going to be Shavuot in just a couple of days. And thousands of people were going to come to that space. Were they going to wander through the alleyways? Were they going to cram into that small 10-foot space in front of the wall? But of course, those buildings had people in them who lived there. And they were forced out. Gone. Go away. This is ours now. So that theme of ownership and dominance and who's native to whose space is this anyways? Well, in this case, the Israeli government decided, and the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kolik, decided this is ours, and so we're going to make room for us. And if others have to move, then they have to move. That space used to be called the Moroccan Quarter. It was actually the 5th quarter of Jerusalem. Tells you how things are kind of messed up if you have 5 quarters in a space. Well, in this case, there was a 5th quarter, and now it's a plaza, and now it's an open space. But the memories may be there. I don't know if there's a plaque there indicating anything. I would guess not. So what happened after that? In August of '67, after the war was over, the Arab League met in Khartoum, and they made 3 statements of no. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. In December of '67, the United Nations issued its famous Land for Peace Resolution 242, which said that if Israel would give up territories, or the territories, they could get peace. This is actually a debate between the French text and the English text, because one says Israel has to give up the territories, implying all of them, including East Jerusalem, while the English version says they must give up territories conquered in this. So that implies maybe most of them, some of them, but not necessarily all of them. Because I have to tell you, from June 7th, after the conquest, Israel was never going to give back the Western Wall. Period. End of story. So what would happen next? Jerusalem continued as the capital of Israel, but now there were thousands of Palestinians who were resident in the city of Jerusalem. The East Jerusalemites were made permanent residents of Israel. They were not given citizenship automatically. They might not have accepted it if offered, but they were made permanent residents, which is different from Arabs living in the West Bank, which is different from the status of Arabs living in Gaza in that time. They each had their own kind of limbo status. But the Arabs and the Palestinians living in East Jerusalem became these permanent residents as long as they didn't leave. Because if you left the country for too long, you could get your permanent residency made unpermanent, and then you couldn't return. So they were permanent residents who could become citizens if they applied to do so. But only about 5% of East Jerusalem Palestinians have chosen to apply for citizenship. Some of it is not normalizing with Israel, and some of it is the hassles and the bureaucracy and the fact that you can still get denied and all the hoops you have to jump through, because after all, the Israeli officials aren't so interested in having that many more citizens of Israel who are of Palestinian background. In 1980, Israel annexed East Jerusalem and said it's ours, legally, although most people haven't recognized that. And they began to rebury people, or bury people again, I guess, on the Mount of Olives. There's a particular irony. Menachem Begin, who was a right-wing prime minister during the time of annexing East Jerusalem to Jerusalem, died in the mid-1980s. And when he died, he said, "I want to be buried next to my colleagues in the Irgun, the pre-state Revolutionary Guard, that were killed by the British as terrorists. I want to be buried next to them on the Mount of Olives." But I'll also point out the Mount of Olives is in East Jerusalem. And Begin did not want to give back an inch of land that he had conquered in East Jerusalem or the West Bank. And so it's almost as if he said, literally, "Over my dead body, are you giving back this territory? Because that's where my body will be." Over the years, East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem have become somewhat integrated, not by people, but in utilities, in roads, in how the population is domiciled, because now you have Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. Not very many mixed neighborhoods, but you have Jewish neighborhoods growing in East Jerusalem, and unfortunately, sometimes attempts to push Palestinians out of neighborhoods in East Jerusalem to create more room for Jewish neighborhoods. Do you define them as neighborhoods, or are they settlements? Well, that's a matter for debate, but technically they're over that green line. They don't count as living in Israel pre-1967 war. And some things have been improved for the best. That no man's land behind the King David Hotel is now a beautiful artist colony and a nice way to walk from part of Jerusalem to the old city walls. There's continued tensions over these Jewish claims in Palestinian neighborhoods. And Palestinians also have taken an approach of what they call anti-normalization. So they are able to vote in city elections as permanent residents, but they tend not to. Very few of them choose to vote in those elections, and what that means is they have nobody on the city council to represent their interests. They first ran a list for the city council election in 2024. That was the first time a Palestinian list ran. They got about 1% of the vote, 2,000 votes or so. Remember, they're 40% of the population of the city. But they only got 1% of the vote because their people chose not to vote. They didn't want to legitimize the position that they're in. During the Oslo peace process, there was a hope that we could find a way, a legal fiction, a workaround, so that both a Palestinian state and the Jewish state could claim Jerusalem/Al-Quds as their capital. Maybe you extend the boundaries of Al-Quds to the east, almost a bridge to Bethlehem, which is not that far away. And so maybe that could be Al-Quds, and then Jerusalem would be the Jewish neighborhoods east of that line and all the Jews in West Jerusalem. And so we call it Jerusalem, they call it Al-Quds, but it's separate territories run by separate governments. Maybe it could have worked. But that's all a dream these days. Between the ongoing integration municipally and the ongoing hostilities nationally. In the last trip I was able to lead to Israel, which was just before the COVID pandemic, we visited 3 major cities. We visited Haifa on the coast of the Mediterranean, we visited Jerusalem, and we visited Tel Aviv. They're each very different cities. Haifa is one of the major Jewish-Arab coexistence bubbles out there. Jerusalem is Jerusalem, as I've described it, and Tel Aviv is a modern city intentionally separated from Jaffa, which is an Arab city. It's a Jewish metropolis. And we asked people at the last dinner that we had as a trip, which was your favorite city? Where would you choose to be if you moved here? And some people liked Haifa for the culture. Some people liked Tel Aviv for the nightlife. I would have chosen Jerusalem because of the history, because of the potential diversity, but also because of the legacy that's there. I've told this story before. The first time I went to that Western Wall, that wall in the heart of the city, and I touched the stones and felt how smooth they were. At the time, I didn't know about the Moroccan Quarter story. I knew there had probably been something there, but now I know more. And yet, if I go to Jerusalem and I go touch those walls, I still feel that connection to my people over generations that touched those walls. There's a reality to living in Jerusalem, but there's also the myth and the legend and the history coexisting at the same time. In our service tonight, we saw this poem by Yehuda Amichai describing what it's like living there with all the tourists seeing you as just a reference point for the drama. But there's also a reality of living there with the other people who are living there and facing those realities of the baggage of the past and the realities of the future and the present. And so I want to share one last reading here. One second. There we go. These are a couple more poems by Yehuda Amichai about living in Jerusalem. This first one was written before the Six-Day War because he talks about the old city as something he can see but not touch in his own life. On a roof in the old city, laundry hanging in the late afternoon sunlight, the white sheet of a woman who is my enemy, the towel of a man who is my enemy, to wipe off the sweat of his brow. In the sky of the old city, a kite. At the other end of the string, a child I can't see because of the wall. We have put up many flags. They have put up many flags to make us think that they're happy, to make them think that we're happy. The flags. And finally, ecology of Jerusalem. The air over Jerusalem is saturated with prayers and dreams, like the air over industrial cities. It's hard to breathe. And from time to time, a new shipment of history arrives, and the houses and towers are its packing materials. Later, these are discarded and piled up in dumps, and sometimes candles arrive instead of people, and then it's quiet. And sometimes people come instead of candles, and then there's noise. And in enclosed gardens heavy with jasmine, foreign consulates like wicked brides that have been rejected lie in wait for their moment. The layers of Jerusalem and the people of that city.